The Great Ecclesiastical Conspiracy by George Davis and Michael Clark. Copyright 2002. In Search of a City, Vision Publishing. Chapter 1. How did the Greek word ecclesia, meaning a called-out assembly, come to be translated church? Why did the Greek words presbytery, the elderly, apostle, envoy or sent one, and deacon, servant, remain untranslated into their anglicized form? Why was the Greek word presbyteros, older or elderly, translated priest? Why indeed, there is little doubt that these words remained untranslated so that the clergy could redefine them, interpreting them with the strongest institutional and hierarchical connotations. Was this mere ignorance, or a means of creating a ruling class of super saints? It is clear to us that down through the years the scriptures have been subjected to papal tampering. There even remains evidence that some of the early manuscripts were altered. Quote, "But almost all authorities on the text agree that they preserve a better text than the standardized 5th century one, which shows clear signs of having been edited." Erdman's Handbook to the Bible, page 73. End quote. It is also clear that this tampering was to promote and justify a system of church government ordered after the government of the kings of the Gentiles, which Christ had strictly prohibited, saying, "But you shall not be so." See Luke 22, 25, and 26. Whatever happened to the servanthood that Jesus and the early church modeled? How did these servants of the 1st century give way to the pontiff kings of the 4th and 5th centuries? Had Christ's declaration, "But you shall not be so," been forgotten? The early believers followed the Lord's example and instructions on this all-important matter, and they viewed servanthood as the highest vocation. But by the close of the 1st century, the subtle signs of the rise of the bishops began, ever so cunningly, to corrupt the simplicity of the faith and to defile the example of the lowly Christ. As absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, so the corruption began. Like a dead corpse rotting away, in time the church bore only a vague resemblance to what was once living and vibrant. In the 3rd century, the wound worsened by the full marriage of this apostate church to paganism. This new Christianity became the imperial religion of the Roman Empire. It was there, at Constantinople, that the very first Christian temples were constructed. They were merely Christianized pagan temples. The priesthood was fashioned after a mixture of the Old Testament and pagan priesthoods. Finally, Rome had done it. If they could not add Christ to the pantheon, they would bring the pantheon to Christianity. The Romans had long since tried to further unite their empire by uniting all its gods in one temple, the pantheon. There, the worship of the sun was mixed with the worship of the sun, so much so that a 3rd century mosaic from a tomb found under St. Peter's in Rome depicted Christ as the sun god in his chariot. It was not until the 5th century that the worshippers in Rome stopped bowing to the sun before entering St. Peter's Basilica. Quote, "Pope Leo I, in the middle of the 5th century, rebuked worshippers who turned around to bow to the sun before entering St. Peter's Basilica." End quote. Erdman's Handbook to the History of Christianity, page 131. The deception reigned unchecked for 925 years, until William Tyndale challenged this religious institution with the light of the truth. He revealed part of the conspiracy that had enslaved the family of God in this twisted, abnormal thing, which the Pharisaical clergy called the church. Although he revealed some of the conspiracy, changing history forever, it nonetheless remains. The light sent it scurrying into the shadows, only to return in a more subtle, congenial form, an anglicized form. It now smiled as it placed the dagger between the 4th and the 5th rib. A tame beast is still a beast, and though defanged and declawed, it can still cripple and maim. After Tyndale was martyred for his efforts, and all but 2 of his Bibles destroyed, several important events occurred. First, Henry VIII evicted the Catholic Church from England because the Pope refused to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon and sanction his illicit relationship with Anne Boleyn. The break with Rome came in 1534, when Parliament passed the Supremacy Act, making Henry head of the Church of England. Henry was somewhat sympathetic to Luther's views, which opened England as never before to Protestant influences, including translating, printing, and importing Protestant Bibles. Some men, such as Coverdale, were inspired to continue in the spirit of Tyndale's work. There was also the Geneva Bible, which effected great changes throughout Europe. In the tradition of Tyndale, these Bibles no longer promoted the divine right of kings and ruling bishops, but instead recognized the priesthood of all believers. To kings and bishops who exercised absolute authority over the masses, this was intolerable. More than anything else, this set the stage for the translation of a new Bible. The King's New Bible was translated to solidify the station of both king and bishops, preserving and advancing a system of church government that stood in antithesis to Christ's example and teachings, and continues to do so until this very day. We believe in the inspiration and accuracy of the Koine Greek texts of the New Testament. However, the translations that have followed are not as reliable for a number of reasons, not the least of which is ecclesiastical ambition. Historically, this love letter from God that we call the Bible was shaped into a scepter of power in the hands of popes, kings, and would-be kings to further consolidate their power over the masses. Undoubtedly, this very ambition has tainted the translations from Jerome onward. This reached new heights at a time when bishops sought the approval of kings to authorize translations that had been purposefully skewed toward their ecclesiastical paradigm. It is ludicrous to many that the Protestant Church could be guilty of carrying on any of the traditions of the Catholic Church that it so loudly objected to. To some, the idea of an ongoing conspiracy is even more unbelievable because they already possess the unadulterated truth. They hold it in their hands, professing that it is the ultimate authority, the only true Bible, the authorized Bible, the King James Bible. Authorized by whom? No less than King James himself. King James did his part in preserving the conspiracy. An understanding of the political climate of the early 16th century is crucial if we're to comprehend the motives and logic behind the King's New Translation. King James was a staunch advocate of the divine right of kings, as facilitated by puppet bishops. This was the Anglican answer to papal succession, in which active resistance to pope or king was considered a sin worthy of eternal damnation. In his Basilicon Doron, in the second sonnet entitled The Argument of the Book, we catch a glimpse of James's exaggerated appraisal of kingship. Quote, God gives not kings the style of gods in vain, for on his throne his scepter do they sway, and as their subjects ought them to obey, so kings should fear and serve their God again. End quote. Using similar language in his first address to the Parliament, James defended his doctrine of the divine right of kings. He did not mince words regarding his intention to be an absolute monarch over England. He presented the following logic as grounds for his supremacy. Quote, the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and set upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. End quote. True to his words, James dissolved Parliament, and for 10 years thereafter he ruled England without it. Considering James's overstated view of kingship and his disregard for the parliamentarian style of leadership, it is understandable that he would also have apprehensions regarding Presbyterianism. This style of church government was developed by Calvin in Geneva and had no place for kings or bishops. In his excellent book entitled In the Beginning, Alistair McGrath tells of a particular event that took place in Scotland, which shaped James' views on this matter. Quote, his views on this matter were shaped to no small extent by some unpleasant experiences with Scottish presbyteries, particularly under Andrew Melville, a Scottish Presbyterian who had taught at Geneva Academy, and formed a close personal relationship with Calvin's protege, Theodore Beza. At a heated encounter between the king and senior churchman at Falkland Place in October 1596, Melville had physically taken hold of James and accused him of being God's silly vassal. Melville pointedly declared that while they would support James as king in public, in private they all knew perfectly well that Christ was the true king of Scotland, and his kingdom was the Kirk, a kingdom in which James was a mere member, not a lord or head. James was shaken by this physical and verbal assault, not the least because it suggested that Melville and his allies posed a significant threat to the Scottish throne. End quote. In the Beginning, page 140. James also developed a dislike for the Geneva Bible, which was widely read and promoted by the Puritans. At that time it was in fact the most popular Bible in England. James's disdain for the Geneva Bible was not so much due to the translation itself, but primarily because of its marginal notes that promoted the notion that all believers comprised the New Testament priesthood, and that they, not the king, were God's anointed.